The Once and Future Present, Episode 8, The Italian Renaissance, a podcast from Hammer History Productions. Hi everyone, and welcome back to the Once and Future Present. I'm Casey, your student guide through the twists and turns of European history. Today we're exploring the Italian Renaissance, probably the most famous rebirth in all of history. But we're not just here to marvel at paintings and statues. We're diving into politics, economics, power, and the very idea of what it meant to be human. With me, as always, are our resident historians, Professor Theo and Dr. Morgan.
Great to be here, Casey. The Renaissance was as much about ideas and self-definition as it was about art.
And I'm excited too. From urban economics to bloody political struggles, the Renaissance isn't nearly as polished as those museum galleries make it seem.
All right, let's kick off with the big picture. What was the Renaissance, and why did it start in Italy?
The Renaissance, which literally means rebirth, was a cultural and intellectual movement that began in Italy around the 14th century and flourished through the 15th and early 16th centuries. It's often framed as a rediscovery of classical antiquity, Greek and Roman texts, art, architecture, and values. But it was also about innovation, self-awareness, and individual expression.
As for why Italy, it comes down to money and politics. The Italian peninsula wasn't a unified country, but a patchwork of city-states like Florence, Venice, and Milan. These city-states were incredibly wealthy, largely due to trade and banking. Florence, for instance, was one of the richest cities in Europe thanks to its international wool and cloth industry and the banking empire of families like the Medici.
So was Florence like the capital of the Renaissance?
In many ways, yes. Florence was governed by a system known as a commune, an association of free men seeking political and economic independence from nobles. But over time, wealthy merchant guilds gained control, and power ended up in the hands of a few elite families. These were the oligarchies that dominated Renaissance politics.
And as the merchant elites rose, many nobles married into merchant families, creating a hybrid ruling class. Even though cities were technically republics, they often ended up being run by signori, individual rulers, sometimes hereditary, who governed in place of republican institutions.
Wait, what about the people who weren't rich? Did they have any say?
That brings us to the popolo, the common people, often excluded from power. They resented the wealth and influence of the elite and occasionally rebelled. But those revolts, like the Ciompi revolt in Florence, were usually suppressed. Real power remained in the hands of the few.
And when tensions got high or rival families fought, city-states hired condottieri, mercenary military leaders, to restore order or expand their influence. Some condottieri even seized power for themselves and became signori.
This sounds chaotic. How did they keep from constantly going to war?
They didn't entirely avoid it, but they developed a concept called the balance of power. Whenever one city-state looked like it was getting too powerful, the others would form alliances to check its expansion. It was diplomacy, with the threat of mercenary armies always in the background.
So, amidst all this scheming and fighting, people suddenly decided to start painting angels and reading Plato?
Well, the turmoil actually helped fuel cultural innovation. Rulers wanted to show off their sophistication and legitimacy, so they poured money into building lavish courts, commissioning art, and supporting scholarship. This was the era of patronage. Wealthy families, guilds, and even the church competed to sponsor the most impressive works of art, architecture, and literature.
That part confuses me a little. How did paying for art help someone seem more legitimate?
Great question. Think of it this way. Power in Renaissance Italy was often informal, unstable, or recently seized, like with the Medici in Florence. By sponsoring art, rulers and elites associated themselves with beauty, piety, wisdom, and the classical past. Commissioning a grand chapel or a public statue wasn't just generous, it was political messaging. It said, "We belong here, we bring order, We connect this city to ancient greatness.
And the art itself helped reinforce that message. Portraits showed leaders as calm and dignified. Biblical scenes on cathedral walls reminded people of the sponsor's religious devotion. Even mythological themes could signal education and refinement.
So it wasn't just about decoration, it was about image and influence.
Exactly. Art was a tool of statecraft, especially in a time when political structures were fluid and constantly contested.
Is that how we got the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles? You know, Leonardo, Michelangelo, Raphael, and Donatello?
Exactly. And they were more than just artists. They were Renaissance men, deeply skilled in multiple disciplines, from painting and sculpture to engineering and anatomy. This ideal of the well-rounded, accomplished individual is tied to Renaissance individualism, the idea that humans had limitless potential.
And their work was funded by political figures, popes, and wealthy merchants. Take the Medici family in Florence. They weren't just bankers. They essentially ruled the city and sponsored artists like Michelangelo and Brunelleschi.
Who's Brunelleschi?
Filippo Brunelleschi was an architect and engineer who designed the magnificent dome for the Florence Cathedral. His work revived classical principles like symmetry and proportion, combining them with bold new techniques. He even reinvented linear perspective, a mathematical way to depict depth on a flat surface.
So art was changing too?
Dramatically. Artists moved away from the flat, symbolic styles of the Middle Ages and began emphasizing realism, emotion, and human anatomy. They studied nature and the body to portray the world more accurately. This reflects the Renaissance's embrace of secularism, a growing interest in the material world and human experience, not just spiritual salvation.
Okay, but I feel like we're just scratching the surface on the art part. I know there's more to say about Da Vinci and Michelangelo and perspective and all that. Are we going to come back to it?
Absolutely. In fact, Episode 9 is all about Renaissance art. We'll have a special guest in art history join us to explore how artists changed the way we see the world, literally, and how they used new techniques to bring classical ideals and contemporary ambition together on canvas, in marble and in architecture.
We'll go deeper into the big names, Leonardo, Michelangelo, Raphael, but also lesser-known innovators. And we'll ask how art served different social purposes, from glorifying God to glorifying the Medici.
Awesome. So listeners, if you're into color composition and controversy, Episode 9 is for you. Were these ideas just for artists?
Not at all. The intellectual side of the Renaissance is captured in humanism. Humanists believed in studying the classical humanities, grammar, rhetoric, poetry, history, and moral philosophy, as a way to understand human nature and improve society. But here's the key shift. Humanism marked a departure from medieval scholasticism. Scholasticism was the dominant intellectual tradition of the Middle Ages, emphasizing logic, dialectic argument, and the reconciliation of classical philosophy with Christian theology. It was deeply tied to universities and often felt rigid or abstract. In contrast, Renaissance humanists emphasized language, ethics, and civic responsibility. They wanted to prepare citizens to participate in public life, not just argue theological fine points.
Another reason for the shift was the trauma of the Black Death. The plague devastated Europe in the 14th century, killing a massive portion of the population. That experience deeply shook people's worldview. Many began to question medieval certainties, including the dominance of the church and the idea that earthly suffering was the path to salvation. The result was a growing interest in this world, in beauty, achievement, and the legacy individuals could leave behind.
That sense of uncertainty fueled a desire to reclaim the wisdom of the ancients. Humanism was a way to find stability and meaning, rooted in human experience. The texts of Cicero, Plato, and Aristotle offered guidance on how to live, govern, and think, even in chaotic times.
And in cities like Florence, this became civic humanism. Thinkers argued that educated citizens had a duty to participate in public affairs and use their knowledge to benefit the community. They looked to ancient Rome for inspiration and saw republican government as a path to virtue.
But didn't some people think this went against religion?
That concern definitely grew over time. But early on, many humanists didn't see a contradiction. They believed ancient wisdom could complement Christian faith. As humanism spread beyond Italy, this blending of classical learning and Christian values gave rise to Christian humanism.
Where did that happen?
Mainly in the north, places like the Holy Roman Empire, England, and the Low Countries. Thinkers like Erasmus used humanist techniques to study the Bible and critique corruption in the church. Erasmus wanted reform, not revolution. He famously wrote The Praise of Folly to satirize the church's excesses.
Another key figure was Thomas More, an English lawyer and author of Utopia, a fictional society where reason and equality prevailed. Like Erasmus, More believed education and Christian virtue could fix social problems.
That sounds kind of idealistic. Did these ideas actually spread?
Yes, and the key was the printing press. Invented by Johannes Gutenberg around 1450, it revolutionized communication. Books became cheaper, more available, and more standardized. This helped spread humanist thought, religious critiques, scientific knowledge, you name it.
So regular people could read too.
Eventually, literacy grew, especially in cities. But even before widespread literacy, printed materials circulated among elites and clergy, dramatically increasing the speed at which ideas traveled.
Okay, here's a name I've seen in the chapter. Girolamo Savonarola. What was his deal?
Ah, yes, Florence's fiery preacher. Savonarola condemned the corruption and secularism of the Renaissance. He led a brief theocratic regime in the 1490s and staged the Bonfire of the Vanities, where people burned books, art, and luxuries in the name of religious renewal. For a short time, he overthrew the Medici, but eventually he was excommunicated, tortured, and executed.
Whoa, so not everyone loved the Renaissance?
Exactly. The Renaissance wasn't universally embraced, and there were real tensions between traditional religious values and new secular ideals. Plus, not everyone benefited equally. Wealth, education, and influence remained concentrated among elites.
Speaking of power, what about The Prince? I've heard it's super famous.
It is. The Prince was written by Niccolò Machiavelli, a political thinker from Florence. He argued that rulers should do whatever it takes to maintain stability and power, even if it means lying, manipulating, or using violence.
Machiavelli's view of politics was rooted in human nature as it is, not as we wish it to be. He believed in virtù, a leader's strength, decisiveness, and ability to shape fortune. This was a break from the medieval belief that rulers should always act morally or by divine right.
But there's more to it than just ruthlessness. Machiavelli was deeply concerned with the relationship between the people and the state. In his view, a good prince must be able to protect the state from external threats and internal chaos. He must meet the basic needs of the population: security, stability, and a sense of order. A predictable justice system, not arbitrary punishment, was essential for building trust.
And that ties into his revolutionary ideas about legitimacy. In the Middle Ages, power was often justified through the divine right of kings. Rulers claimed their authority came from God. Machiavelli was one of the first thinkers to shift that conversation. He suggested that authority could be derived from effectiveness and from the consent of the governed. In other words, if a ruler delivered peace and stability, that alone could make him legitimate.
This was a foundational idea for modern political thought. It laid the groundwork for later theories about social contracts, republicanism, and even democracy. Machiavelli wasn't promoting tyranny. He was trying to figure out what makes governments work and last, especially in dangerous times.
So Machiavelli was basically saying it's okay to be ruthless if it works?
In some ways, yes. But remember, he wasn't celebrating cruelty. He wanted rulers to preserve order in a dangerous world. His ideas mark a shift toward realism in political theory.
That's deep. So in a way, the Renaissance wasn't just about beauty and knowledge. It was about power too?
Always. Power, prestige, and the struggle for control, whether in politics, culture, or religion, shaped every part of the Renaissance.
One last thing, I saw the term New Christians. Who were they?
That term referred to Jews and Muslims who converted to Christianity in Spain and Portugal, often under pressure. Many of these conversos still face suspicion and discrimination, especially as the Spanish monarchy pursued religious unity. Their rise in government and finance provoked resentment and led to the Spanish Inquisition.
So even during the Renaissance, there was still a lot of intolerance?
Yes, the Renaissance didn't erase prejudice, it coexisted with it. Even as Europe celebrated human potential, it also reinforced social hierarchies and excluded entire groups from its cultural and political life.
And in places like Spain, religion and politics became deeply intertwined. The expulsion of Jews in 1492 and the increasing persecution of Muslims and conversos were tied to the ambitions of Ferdinand and Isabella, who were working to consolidate their power. Their marriage united two major kingdoms and helped lay the foundations for a centralized Spanish monarchy.
So this is where the idea of a nation-state starts coming together?
Exactly. While Italy remained a collection of city-states, monarchs in places like Spain, France, and England were beginning to centralize authority. They built standing armies, expanded bureaucracies, and created stronger ties between crown and people, often at the expense of nobles or regional rulers.
And these developments were deeply influenced by Renaissance ideas. Humanism encouraged rulers to view themselves as civic leaders with responsibility for the well-being of their subjects. Renaissance diplomacy and administrative reforms also shaped how these monarchies functioned.
So, while Italy was producing art and philosophy, other parts of Europe were building something more like modern governments?
That's right. Different regions experienced the Renaissance differently. In some places, it inspired cultural flourishing. In others, it laid the groundwork for stronger, more unified states.
Got it. So the Renaissance wasn't all glowing paintings and perfect sculptures. It was messy, complicated, and full of contradictions. Kind of like the present.
That's a great takeaway, Casey.
The Renaissance reminds us that history is never just about beauty. It's about power, ideas, conflict, and change.
Thanks, both of you, and thank you to our listeners for joining us on the Once and Future Present. Next time, we have a special guest for episode 9 who is going to discuss the transition from late medieval to Renaissance art and architecture. Then in episode 10, we'll ask the big question: did the Renaissance improve life for women? Spoiler alert, not everyone agrees. Until then, stay curious, think critically,